Some of the hardest problems in the world exist far above the planet. Our job? To launch the smartest solutions, to protect our satellites, clean up our clutter, to propel breakthroughs in propulsion, to learn more about our place in the universe, to outpace emerging threats. Every day, the Aerospace Corporation uses the latest technologies to ensure our nation's safety and leadership in space.
Hi, and welcome to the Space Policy Show. As always, you can find us on Twitter using hashtag the Space Policy Show, and you can engage with our experts on Vimeo using the chat box. We'd also like it if you would sign up for our latest news alerts at aerospace.org/policy. Today's episode is on space security and SSA, a view from Europe. In today's episode, we'll take a look at cooperation in space security and space situational awareness, and specifically what that looks like in Europe. We'll hear about the latest developments in the EU Space Surveillance and Tracking Program from Aerospace's Gina Galasso and special guest Dr. Regina Peldszus. Dr. Peldszus is a senior policy officer with the Federal Ministry of Economic Affairs and Energy, on secondment from the German space agency DLR. Until September 2020, she served as the head of delegation to the consortium of EU member states, implementing the EU Space Surveillance and Tracking EU SST initiative. Gina Galasso is managing director of Aerospace's subsidiary in the UK that provides independent technical advice to the United Kingdom Space Enterprise to strengthen their space capabilities. Over to you, Gina, to get us started.
Thank you, Rebecca. Hi, Regina. It's good to see you virtually. I would like it to be in person, but maybe we will do that in the summertime.
Thanks so much, Gina. It's a real pleasure seeing you as always. And thank you ever so much for having me today.
Normally, we focus on things within the U.S. and that affect the U.S. directly. And now we have an opportunity to broaden this to U.S. allies. So we are delighted to have you here. So Regina, give us some view and some insights into how Europe is now tackling space security.
Okay, yeah, so I'm really glad to give an overview on the European landscape as it currently is. So this can be a bit daunting sometimes, and much in the same way actually as when we in Europe look across the pond and at all the different various bodies and committees and agencies that are involved in space, and especially if we look at space security. But basically, we have a number of actors in Europe that make up the overall space ecosystem or the space programs. So next to the national space agencies such as DLR or the French space agency CNES or Italian space agency ASI, we have two main actors, the European Space Agency, ESA, and also the EU, the European Union, which conducts space activities and, for instance, owns the Galileo navigation system and the Copernicus Earth observation system. And these two bodies or these two organizations have member states. To a large extent, they overlap, but not quite. But they have very different forms of governance. So they have different decision-making mechanisms and also different ways to absorb and to distribute budget. But what's really interesting at the moment is that this year we're looking at a lot of changes and consolidation in Europe as such. So I think what we talk about a little bit is how some of the space security and SSA aspects are slotting into the new space program of the European Union. And we will see also this year how a lot of relationships will be reforged between also ESA and the EU on some of the things that they do, because on the one hand side, we have a real unique technical heritage on the ESA side, and then we have the mechanisms and the political force behind the European Union on the other hand. So this is really significant because for the entire region, because if you take all of this and you combine it, we're looking at the second space power in the world. And there's a lot happening at the moment. So I'm really happy to be with you and to share some of these thoughts today.
So one of the questions or one of the things that I come across outside of the US mostly is because normally the budgets are a little bit smaller and even some of the capability in regards to military and civilian side, there's a lot of synergies, I think more so than we have in the US. Is that true? And can you provide a bit more information on that?
Yeah, sure. So I can maybe sketch out a little bit how the two sides interact. So generally, we've had a very strong civilian community in Europe, of course, but there's also always been the quest for synergies of the different side, especially as we look at dual-use technology, but increasingly also at interactions between the two communities for certain problems. And one of the examples, for instance, for this civil-military cooperation would be SSA, Space Situational Awareness, where, just to give you an example from the German side, we have a civil mil or a whole of government approach to SSA. So, for instance, we have an SSA center that's overseen by the Ministry of Defense and Ministry of Economy, where I'm currently at, and that's operated by the Air Force and the Space Agency. So the civilians and the military stakeholders work together. And this is the case for a number of other European countries and member states, and where basically you have both stakeholders interacting and looking at shared problems. And this is translated also on the European level, and the European Union level. So, for instance, to stay within the area of SSA, we now have this EU SSA program with a strong space surveillance and tracking component for the new space program that's coming up. And as you may recall, EUSST is an initiative that for the past 6 years has brought together different European Union member states who come together to fuse existing sensors that they have that are already in operation. And they join this capability together to put services out for the community to use. So for instance, today they have 40 sensors, a network, and a bit over, I think, 200 spacecraft that are currently registered for collision avoidance service. And this is a civilian initiative, but it's also involving military and security stakeholders in both inside the government governance, but also inside the infrastructure that they operate. And the governance is such that basically the member states can, due to the security interests that they have, retain the authority and the tasking authority over their sensors, and also bring together a mix of sensors, so civilian, scientific, commercial, military operated sensors, and really collaborate on that scale. And there's a security committee, for instance, to draft data policy. There are military stakeholders that sit in the governance bodies and the technical bodies, part of that group. And basically, all of it slots into the security architecture that we're seeing to emerge in the European Union space program that's entering into force this year, where we have the other programs, Galileo and Copernicus, and then also new programs like SSA, who have to be have a unique security governance, but come in there. So that we have a lot of interactions between the two communities there. And just to give you a little bit of scale, of course, SST is a relatively small program, quite small compared to Galileo and Copernicus, to the large flagships. But I think it's an important area that we need to safeguard our infrastructure, and it's a good case study where civil and military can work together to address a shared problem that they have, which is the increasingly complex situation in orbit, even though they may have very different organizational and professional cultures.
Very interesting. Thank you, Regina. So we know that the UK has been very integral to Europe's space security, but now that they have left the EU, how has that influenced and shaped some of the latest developments?
Yeah, so for EUSST, like you said, they were one of the founding members and partners, and a very valuable partner in for the area of SSA and SST. And now, as part of the Brexit arrangement, they're not part of the European Union program for that anymore, but they do still receive services, which is in the spirit of the new space program for the SST component, which foresees that services such as collision avoidance, re-entry and fragmentation alerts are also delivered to stakeholders beyond Europe, or owners and operators beyond Europe. But the departure of the UK happened for us at a time where we were also enlarging the group of participating member states who make up the SST consortium or the SST partnership. So we're consolidating and growing this in the new program. So we can't really go into details right now because we're at a phase of getting together and getting to know the interested states, but we can say it's nearly a dozen states that are interested in joining. And I think we're going to grow the program in that sense. Having said that, the UK remains a part, of course, of the European Space Agency. And there's also a number of other fora in multilateral cooperation where the UK remains a key partner.
Thank you, Regina. That's very interesting. It's good to hear that the UK still is very important as far as Europe's space security is concerned. So you talked about a lot of the changes and things that are going on in Europe right now. We know that there's been a lot of changes across the pond here in the US. So what has that meant for US-German cooperation and US-European cooperation on space security?
Mm-hmm. So thanks. I think I want to highlight different types of cooperation. So roughly we can distinguish the bilateral side and the multilateral side, and also different levels of abstraction, from the working level to really high level engagement. So bilaterally, of course, one thing that we need to bear in mind for SSA specifically is that we in European actors largely rely on US data still. For SSA, so data from the 18th Space Control Squadron. So on the military to military side, there are sharing agreements bilaterally for the exchange of SSA and space situational awareness data. So that's one of the examples for mil-to-mil cooperation, really for operations. And on the civilian side, we're mirroring this to an extent in the area of SST, where there's technical level exchanges with US colleagues who are developing the open architecture data repository, which resonates a lot with the database that we are constructing out of multiple data sources on the European side and SST as well. So I think both sides there look at each other with great interest in comparing notes on how this can work, fusing different type of data sources. So these would be two points on military and civilian cooperation. And then of course there's other multilateral fora. For instance, I just mentioned that the UK is still part of a number of really important fora and formats where other European actors such as France, the UK and Germany also participate. They are run on the military side. I'm thinking here of two fora, including Combined Space Operations, or CSPO initiative, which is about coordinating approaches to space defense and space security. And of course, the counterpart, which is a little bit more foresight related, of Schreiber War Games, which is looking at different futures in space security. So these are basically settings where the UK, despite not being in the EU anymore, but and then being a part of ESA, they are also standalone partners in these international or transatlantic groups of cooperation. And so these are just two examples. There are many other formal settings and dialogues going on the many different strands of engagement, both in the EU, both bilaterally in the different member states and national space agencies, and of course also with ESA.
Wonderful. That is very interesting. One of the things I was thinking about as you were talking is, so the EU SST is establishing itself, leveraging national assets. How much is it using and sharing assets and data with the US? Is it meant to be kind of standalone, for lack of a better word, kind of independent, or is it working in cooperation with the US?
Right now, it's not so much an exchange, but certainly we're talking about how this can work in the future. So for now, it's still a one-way, informing the European side with US data. But in the future, of course, the idea is to contribute to burden sharing in the domain of SSA, also through these efforts.
Thanks, Regina, for talking about the collaboration between the US and Germany and the US and Europe in regards to space security. One of the things I found interesting, and want to know if you can answer this question. So my understanding is on the EU SST, you are taking national assets, national level capability, and pulling those together so that they work more synergistic and building upon those areas. So I actually have two questions. How much influence or an impact is the EU having on pulling these things together? And then are there challenges at the national level? Because each nation, is responsible for their own national security. And so are there challenges that's across borders, even though it's, for a common cause or at the EU level?
Sure. I think this is a really excellent question, and actually a question that has been asked since the very inception of the program, because I think that it hints at the justification of the program and also the reason for being. We have this model of member states because the different member states wanted to retain the ownership and also the tasking authority over their own census, which they had invested in for some time already. I mean, we have very different sensors in our network, from old, giant, really monolithic sensors that have been in operation for a long time to really cutting edge new systems, lots of different sensor classes. And of course, like I mentioned earlier, sensors that are either operated by the military or jointly operated civilian military, or even sensors that each member state tasks and procures from the commercial and scientific side. So we're bringing all these very heterogeneous assets together. The funding that we receive from the European Union is basically supporting this effort and putting it together. So we're not developing anything from scratch, at least not in the very first part. There's, of course, some developments on upgrading and on further tweaking the performance of sensors, and also to come at to arrive at a larger network in the end of the day, have better global coverage and see a little bit more in certain orbital regimes. But the beauty or the goal of that model was always that the European Union can have can make available these sensors that the member states are sharing with the community who maybe don't have these sensors and still want to register for collision avoidance services for free. But basically the ownership and the tasking authority remains with the member states. And they, this is because they see security interests involved in, the sensitivity of certain data or the confidentiality of data that comes out of these sensors. And that then is also a question how we put everything together in a database, which is in a way the unique European level thing that we've created together, while the sensors remain where they are, but we put them, we fuse the data together in that database.
Thank you, Regina. That was very interesting. I don't know if I got the point where the EU is contributing to the EU SST. What actually is their role? Can you expand upon that?
Yeah, sure. So basically, the EU oversees the implementation of the program. They have put together the basically the regulation and the legal basis for this, and they're overseeing the different instruments that they've put in place, for the financial side and so forth. But the actual operation and the implementation is done by the consortium, and in future it's going to be called the partnership of different member states who collaborate together and to take care of the different main SST functions of sensors, of data processing and service provision. So the EU oversees this, and we have developed a really good collaboration in the past few years with our interlocutors there, who have become our sparring partners in a way, and they provide the funding from the member states, which of course doesn't cover everything, but it supports the joining together. So that's their role. And of course, in the new program that we're seeing now that's entering into force this year, when SST moves from this initiative into a proper program component in its own right, the EU will have, of course, another role in overseeing this, and the whole program will be slotted into the remainder of the EU space program. So there's going to be more interfaces on security and the security architecture of the European Union, and also on SST. So the interactions are going to get closer, but the model that the sensors remain under the authority of the member state each of the member states remains the same.
Okay, so I know the SST consortium started off, I think, of 5 different nations. I believe that's grown. Is that right? And can you tell us who is part of the consortia at this point?
Sure. So in the beginning, in 2015, we formed the consortium with 5 member states. So the initial founding partners were France, Germany, UK, Italy, and Spain. And then a couple of years afterwards, we enlarged with new member states who wanted to contribute their sensors to bring their own assets into the mix. That was Poland, Portugal, and Romania. And now we are looking at another enlargement as part of the new space program. So we're looking at another group that's going to be joining us, and we're really excited about that.
So as you expand, so that's very interesting, and it is getting larger. But as you expand, I'm wondering, to be part of this consortium, do you have to have certain capability to bring to the table? What makes you be able to join a group like this, be selected to participate?
Right. So the eligibility criteria, if you will, are set out in the legal basis. So you would bring a sensor into to the table, or some other critical capability that would be required as we grow the consortium and the partnership now. What's really interesting in Europe is that we have a lot of different member states, and we have member states that have been doing SSA regardless of SST for decades, or who have their own military maneuverable satellites. They need to take care of them, so they've been doing that. And we have others who maybe have some assets that they have been operating in the science side, telescopes, or in the astronomy area. So we have a lot of different assets, and we even have a number of member states who have interesting locations, maybe, or other types of expertise to contribute. And what we're looking at right now is how to fit all these different components and all these different expertises and capabilities into one, and really figure out how we can work together, even though we are very, very different partners. So that's a challenge for us, but I think it's also the beauty of collaborating on this multilateral scale and trying to get everyone around the table and allow them to contribute something that they can bring to the table.
Thank you, Regina. So we've been focusing on the EU SST, and we know the EU has several other space programs. Can you tell me how the EU SST space program relates to the other European Union programs?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question, because they have been designed in a way to really be consolidated as part of this new space program and the new EU space regulation that has been negotiated and finalized in the past few years. So I mentioned very briefly earlier that Galileo and Copernicus are the big 2 flagship programs. So they are really the bulk of the budget, in orders of magnitudes more than SST. But SST is basically contributing to the safeguarding and resilience of these programs, of these 2 main flagship programs. So we have Galileo, Copernicus, and then we have SSA, the SSA program inside the EU space program, and also a governmental communications initiative called GovSatcom. So SST is in there, and the relationship is, there's 2 things I could highlight. So on the one hand, we are looking at how the many security mechanisms that have been created for Galileo and that are overseen by the what's going to be in the future the European Agency for the Space Program, USPA. This security architecture is really going to be the umbrella into which the unique model of SST fits. So they're going to have interactions. So we're going to be using some of the mechanisms and relate to that, and we're going to be having more of an interaction with the stakeholders of that new agency in that area. But also, I think it's interesting to point out that we in SST, the collision avoidance, we do the collision avoidance for the Galileo fleet. So we're directly related to that on the operational side. So that would be 2 examples on how they interact.
Okay, that's very interesting. Thank you for giving us that extra information there. So you talked about there's the new EU Space Program Agency, I think is what it's called. And I think it's early stages now, so I don't know if there's much that you can offer there. But clearly there are changes going on in Europe as they move forward. So are there other challenges or other things that you want to make us aware of?
So I think one of the things that I would point out, given I'm in the civilian side, is that space security doesn't exist in a vacuum. And I think that's becoming really evident in the European region, with all the different actors who all have safety aspects to take care of, but also security interests to observe. And so I think these two elements are really intertwined. And what I want to point out is a little bit how what we do in SSA really resonates also with other areas of space sustainability and safety of operations. So we really see that security is not like a standalone thing, but it's really related and linked to these other aspects. And especially at this intersection, we want to ensure that we can ensure that the space environment and the orbital environment remains safe for us to use and secure to use. And we want to avoid that there's degradation and accidents, which could happen, for instance, through miscalculation, through mishaps or misperceptions even. So we see that there's a very interesting intersection between space safety and space security. And I think this is going to be a really pronounced area of thinking and also of operational exchange and policy making in that context for the different nations, but also for the larger actors and for multilateral collaboration, of course. And so I think, we talked in the past a lot about the future of the space environment, and I recall, of course, the dialogues that we often have at the margin of large conferences, which Aerospace and also some of the agencies in Europe engage in together, which are always really enriching. And of course, we're looking at the future of unprecedented complexity and maybe even complicatedness in orbit. So I think this is something that we see and that we need to tackle. And I don't know if you want to maybe hear a little bit about space traffic management or something that we're thinking along those lines.
Sure, that would be good. Space traffic management obviously
Yeah.
is front and center, as you say, with so much debris and so many more satellites that are on orbit. It is a big problem. So yes, I'd love to hear your
Yeah.
thoughts.
Sure. So we see, especially if we come from a Ministry of Economy perspective, which is a little bit of a different lens than our colleagues from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, for instance, who are looking at arms control, and Ministry of Defense, who are looking at deterrence or conflict in space. So we're really looking at how space is going to be used commercially, but also in terms of application in science in the future. And SSA, we believe, can be an excellent building block for space traffic management in the future. And I think there's going to be a lot of dialogue going on in Europe, because in the past couple of years, we've seen Space Policy Directive number 3, which resonated a lot with, nascent dialogue that was going on in Europe. Ep.53 prompted a lot of thought, a lot of reflection, a lot of soul searching on the European side. And right now, it's a really interesting time for conversations that are happening on many different levels, from operations to R&D, to policy, to regulation, even inside Europe. So within the European actors, but also with European actors and transatlantic and international actors in the requisite fora. So there are a lot of interesting settings here. And I think it's going to be, the next year is going to be characterized a lot also from some European contributions in that side, in that area of STM.
So this may be a loaded question. So I wanted to ask you, because these are conversations that have been going on quite a long time in regards to, global view on STM and how to handle things. That it becomes clearer and clearer that we need to get some solutions sooner rather than later. So in your view, and this is Regina's view, what is your view on when do you think there will be some kind of an agreement or resolution where you have most countries, spacefaring countries, that will participate in some resolution?
Yeah. Good question. I think, and this, like you said, I would probably speak from my own professional background or my thoughts that I have on this domain. I think, if that's okay. So I think, to be honest, I'm not sure when we're going to see it, because there's a lot of enriching dialogue taking place, but I think we haven't really yet come to consensus on how we want this to be organized, and then also scaled up to maybe a setting where everyone would participate. So I think what I would say is, I would phrase that, when do I think that this is taking place? I would probably phrase it the other way around and say, I'm hoping it takes place before we see a systemic or a normal, so-called normal accident in space. So if I look back at, if we look at space as a complex system, or a very largely complex system of systems, then I think it's a matter of time where we have close calls, small accidents, and we don't want to have a large accident, which will inevitably happen in these kind of complex systems. We've seen it in other safety critical domains, that we basically don't want this to happen. And I think we should ideally have a system in place which may not be a global STM regime, but for sure it should be increased transparency and increased multilateral cooperation for data sharing, for bringing everyone's expertise to the table, so we can avoid that kind of event.
So that makes sense. It would be, I guess, my response as well. And as you were talking, I'm sitting here thinking, obviously, more of the satellites that are on orbit now, or soon to be on orbit, are going to be commercial. So if the governments can't decide on something, I'm assuming, there's a big interest on the commercial side to make sure that they can get to space safely and operate in space safely. So do you think something may come forward from the commercial side before there is government level agreement?
Yeah, I think we see a lot of super interesting proposals from all sides. We see it from the commercial industry side, we see it from government, we see it from even the scientific and think tank sector. So I think we need to be able to fuse these ideas, and we need to leverage initiatives that we already have, be it SST or be it other operators sharing data already. I mean, we have SDA, where many European partners, for instance, are members. So I think we need all these different initiatives and all this different thinking in order to arrive at some kind of mechanism, at least for increased transparency and increased safety of operations, which then again contributes to security.
So, yeah, I agree, completely agree. So I wanted to ask you one final question. So we've been talking about Europe and space security in a couple different aspects here. Europe clearly is taking a stronger and more role on space security aspects, which is fantastic. So as you start doing that and increasing in those areas, what are the challenges, the biggest challenges Europe faces on developing more space security capability?
Generally, I think the challenge in Europe is that we have a very mixed sector. So we have lots of member states who all have their different capabilities, industries, and so forth. So it's not as, let's say, consolidated as a market or an ecosystem such as that of the US, for instance. And I think that's a challenge, but I think in Europe it's also seen as a strength. So we have a lot of different bits that we can fit together. Of course, we always, one of the main things that we're trying to avoid is duplication. And, we don't want to do things, we want some kind of redundancy, but we don't want to duplicate any efforts because, resources, especially right now, these days are limited, and we want to ensure that we put, our resources where, we can add value on that, for instance. But so this is a little bit similar in Europe, but I think we can draw on the strength of these different actors. And I think that's going to be something that they will have to leverage more and more. And a lot of people are thinking about this at the moment.
Yeah, that makes sense. No surprise that people are really looking at this very, very hard. So is there anything you want to bring forward that I didn't address that you wanted to share with the Space Policy Show and the audience?
Thanks so much, Gina. Well, I can just say it's been a really interesting discussion with you as always. And maybe just one thought that, what we talked about today is just one vantage point of, one European, constituent. So there's lots of other perspectives and really multifaceted lenses that we see that through. So I'm really hoping you can, like you said already, there are lots of more really interesting interlocutors who can share their experiences. And I think it's a really interesting time for Europe this year. And I think it's going to be, it's always going to be worth looking across the pond for space security, for SSA, but a lot of other things that are happening in space.
Excellent. I think this has been very interesting, and I know we will see you again. I hope personally to see you in person, maybe at the Space Symposium or AMOS this year. Over to you, Rebecca.
A big thanks to Gina and Regina for that great insight into the European perspective of space safety. And thank you to our production team, Colleen Stover, James Liggins, and Sarah Pannoni. As always, check us out on Twitter using hashtag The Space Policy Show and sign up for our latest news alerts at aerospace.org/policy. Tune in next week for another great episode. We'll see you then.